Hey, what's your secret? You got the kind of vibe that leaves me speechless. It could be model multitasking genius. Yeah, you got it all. Hey.
Well, today our show is about an amazing woman named Elinor Ostrom. She's a woman who pushed the envelope in the academia world when women weren't well respected in that community. I speak with Erik Nordman, an Ostrom Scholar and author of The Uncommon Knowledge of Elinor Ostrom, Essential Lessons for Collective Action. In his book, he explores the ideas of Elinor Ostrom, the first woman to win a Nobel Prize in economics. And she argued that addressing a global problem like climate change will require a truly collective response, not just from governments, but at the individual, local, and regional levels as well. Please visit islandpress.org for this book and other books that inspire change. You can purchase Erik's book there, and you, as listeners, can get a 20% discount by using the discount code in all caps, UNCOMMON. Enjoy the show. So welcome to the show today, Erik. Thank you for joining.
My pleasure, Marcia.
I'm excited to learn more about Elinor and her unique ways of approaching natural resource management and such. So before we get into all that, though, I would love it if you could tell us a little bit about yourself and your focus of research and how you became involved with being an Ostrom Scholar.
Sure, thanks.
Yeah.
So I'm a professor of natural resources management at Grand Valley State University outside of Grand Rapids. I've been there for 15 years, and I teach courses in environmental economics and natural resource policy, and I've taught over the years about Ostrom's work in those classes, kind of introduced the undergraduate students to those ideas. But I found that there wasn't really a good resource for undergraduate students to, dig in a little bit further, or regular people for that matter. Ostrom herself was a prolific writer. She wrote many, many journal articles and books, but it was mostly to an academic audience. And lots of other people that she was associated with have written books about her, but still mostly towards, people with PhDs. So I was looking for a sabbatical project, and I thought, well, maybe I could write a book that introduces Ostrom's life and work, which is really remarkable, to a broader audience and really bring those ideas, into the public conversation a little bit more.
Terrific. And she's an amazing woman from what I can tell. And I think her prolific writing probably came from, I believe I read that she didn't have a television in her home. And she probably wasn't distracted by many, television or things that we can be nowadays.
That's true. She was not really into pop culture at all. She missed out on a lot of those references. A funny story that I learned was after she won the Nobel Prize, she was a question on Jeopardy. And so the people that she worked with were watching Jeopardy, and the question was who was the first woman to win the Nobel Prize in economics? And of course it was Elinor Ostrom. They came into work the next day excited to share this news with her, and she did not know what the show Jeopardy was.
She's like, what's Jeopardy? Yeah.
She was completely unimpressed with that.
Oh, that's great. So good for her. So it can be a distraction for sure. So can you tell us a little bit more about Elinor, and we can get into some of her work? I know that's a very broad question, but you mentioned she was the first woman to win the Nobel Prize, correct? In economics, yep.
In economics, yep. She was the first woman to win a Nobel Prize in economics in 2009. And she passed away shortly after that in 2012, unfortunately. But she was recognized by the Nobel Committee for her groundbreaking analysis in economic governance, especially a subject called the commons. And commons are shared resources, things like fisheries and forests, where they're prone to overuse because everybody has, in an unregulated commons, everybody has access to this resource. Everybody can harvest fish from this pond. Everybody can bring their cows to this pasture. But everybody following that same logic, you're going to harvest more fish, you're going to bring more cows, and eventually that pasture is going to be overgrazed. We're going to remove all the fish from our pond. And that's a situation called the tragedy of the commons. And so Ostrom was looking at this actually before that term was coined by Garrett Hardin in 1968. Ostrom was a graduate student at the University of California at Los Angeles looking at groundwater management. And throughout the 1940s and 50s, the communities around the Los Angeles area were overdrawing the groundwater. So this was a critical resource for not only drinking, but for industrial production because it's very clean and it's very cheap. So, and also for irrigation. So in addition to the Colorado River surface water, this groundwater resource was a really key resource for the community, but it was shared among all these communities, and the groundwater resource doesn't respect those municipal boundaries. So each of these communities was kind of in a pumping race. We're going to use this resource before it runs out. And the neighboring community said, well, we're going to use it before it runs out because if I stop, it's not going to matter. Everybody else is going to keep pumping, right? And Ostrom liked to say, nobody wants to be a sucker, right? And if you stop using that resource, but everybody else doesn't, well, then you're a sucker. You lose out. And you might do that once, but you're not going to do it again. So Ostrom looked at these communities and she saw that they were able to recognize this collective problem of the depleting groundwater and the intruding seawater, the salt water that was coming in. And they were able to work together. And the conventional wisdom held that these communities or individuals would not be able to work together, that the only way to preserve a commons would be to either privatize it and let the market figure it out, or impose regulations from, an outside government, a strong centralized government. Because the thought was the people were trapped, they were doomed to deplete this resource. But Ostrom's work in California as a graduate student showed that people are very creative and you can build trust and reciprocity and people can come together. It's not easy and it's very difficult, but through a deeply democratic process, people can come together to manage these shared resources. And, that graduate work kind of set her on a decades-long career studying resources, these shared resources all over the world, from lobster harvesters, community forests in Nepal, irrigation communities in Spain. She found thousands of examples in which communities creatively came together to manage their own shared resources.
That's very hopeful to hear. And so the Tragedy of the Commons by Hardin. And so just to be clear, the premise of that was basically kind of our conventional way of thinking about natural resources today, right? So there's regulation of government, kind of top down, and private property ownership and such, correct? And
that's right.
And she was saying that, hey, we can do this collectively. We don't have to have a government rule what we're doing so much.
Right. Hardin was very clear that there were only two ways to resolve this situation. Yeah. That it was either government imposition, government regulations, or privatization. That communities were trapped. And Hardin specifically used this term tragedy in the ancient Greek way of envisioning a tragedy, which is that people are, have this fate that the gods have spoken, and even if you're, try to avoid it, if you try to escape, you can't, right? No matter what.
Yeah.
And he used that term tragedy very specifically. He believed that people were doomed. Yeah. So no, there is this third way, and in between private property rights and markets and on one extreme and government intervention on the other is this whole area of civil society institutions where we can come together, we can form clubs, we can form associations, and we can together create these formal rules or informal expectations of behavior and manage the resources ourselves. But it takes a big commitment to this, democratic process to do that. So it doesn't always work, but it is a third way that Hardin completely.
Gotcha. So he brought this up in 1968, and she was just starting her work. Did they have any interesting conversations with each other? Did they interact often on this topic, or even argue or work together at all?
Yes,
Yeah.
actually, they had a long-term correspondence about these issues.
Mm-hmm.
Ostrom spent her entire academic career at Indiana University, and she was married to her husband, Vincent Ostrom, who was also a professor of political science there. And together they started a research center called the Workshop in Political Theory and Policy Analysis back in 1973, shortly after Harding wrote that essay, The Tragedy of the Commons, in 68. And the Ostroms, Indiana University invited Garrett Harding to give a guest lecture, a prestigious guest lecture at Indiana University. I think it was in 1976. And he was still speaking on this tragedy of the commons issue, specifically on how it applies to global population. Because back in the late 60s and early 70s, there was a big emphasis on population control. And Harding came to Indiana University, and Elinor Ostrom was in the audience and saw him talking about how population is the commons problem. And that's really what the tragedy of the commons was about, population. And the only two ways to deal with population is to control it, either through private property rights or government imposing restrictions on these things. And Ostrom was really taken aback by what he was saying. She had him over for dinner. She served him hamburger helper casserole. And they started a long conversation that went on for many years, writing letters back and forth, having this very passionate argument, but very civil and respectful argument over the role of institutions and democracy and things like that.
That's great. That's very bold, because she was entering this field at a time where women weren't really accepted or easily accepted, I should say, and for her to be outspoken. What challenges did she face with that?
She was definitely coming into the profession at a time when it was pretty unusual for a woman to have a PhD to begin with. After she finished her undergraduate degree, she got married to her first husband, who went to law school in Boston. So the two of them moved to Boston. She really wanted to go back to school for a graduate degree, and her husband wasn't really comfortable with that. And she did not want to be the corporate lawyer's wife, hosting parties. And, that really just wasn't her thing. So they actually got divorced. She moved back to California, tried to get into UCLA graduate school in economics. Her undergraduate degree was in political science, but she had taken courses in economics and actually was hired to grade freshman economics papers. So she was an excellent student. But the economics department rejected her graduate application because she didn't have these advanced math courses that they required. Then she applied for the graduate program in political science. The political science department had not accepted any women for decades. And the university said, look, you have to accept some women into the program. So they begrudgingly accepted a cohort of 4 female students into the program. They were really concerned that these female students would water down the program, that,
oh my gosh,
that they wouldn't be gainfully employed, and that we're a prestigious university. We want our graduates to go on to these prestigious careers. And they were not hopeful that the female students could ever aspire to that. And the irony is that Ostrom won the Nobel Prize 50 years later in economics. So definitely she faced a lot of uphill challenges throughout her career.
It sounded like she had the personality to withstand that. That's great. And
yes.
So, we were talking about the commons, and, so what are the basic principles of the commons to, how did she, it seems like education is the key, right, to get this out, this type of natural resource management. I'm kind of blending two topics together there. Sorry.
Sure. Well, she, with her graduate students at Indiana University, built this database of these situations where people were managing common pool resources. So, and these case studies were all spread out across different disciplines. So, people like James Atchison at the University of Maine were studying lobster fisheries, and he's an anthropologist. And, there were people working in forestry or people working in sociology and historians documenting the irrigation communities in Spain, in Valencia, Spain. So there was this knowledge that was out there about the communities doing this, but it was all over the place in all these different disciplines. And nobody had, taken a step back and collected all this information. So that's the first thing that she did. After her graduate career looking at LA water, they said, all right, let's go back. Actually, this was in the 1980s. She went back, had a graduate student look back at the situation in LA, 20 years later after she had looked at it. And it was still, those associations were still able to manage their groundwater sustainably. And now let's look at all these other cases around the world that we can find. And what are some commonalities for success, and what happens when they fail, because they often do fail. So they built this database of hundreds and then thousands of cases, and were able to tease apart what she called 8 design principles for successfully governing a common pool resource. And these are things like, the first one is setting physical and social boundaries, right? You got to be able to say, like, okay, this is the pasture where everybody can bring their cows, and this other land over here, you can do what you want with it, but this is the common pasture here. There's a clear boundary. Or in the case of the lobster harvesters in Maine, they have very clear territories about, this is where I put my traps, and over there is where you put your traps. And it's important for us to know where the boundary is, because one, I don't want you competing with me for the lobsters, right? So we're going to have a territory. But in a very practical way, the lines can get tangled up because the traps are, on the bottom. There's a line and a buoy that marks it, and the traps are often linked together. So if we start crossing our lines, then our traps are going to get tangled, and we're going to lose equipment, and that's very costly. So we've got to establish.
Yeah. Oh, I'm sorry. I didn't mean to say they probably don't want to run out of lobster either. I mean, right.
That's right. So there's this physical boundaries, but also the social boundaries. So who has access to this? Now, in the case of lobsters, again, even if I get a license from the state of Maine that says I am allowed to, harvest lobsters, I can't socially just show up and start putting traps out, because I'm not a member of this lobstering community. So there's a strong, and this isn't a legal thing, this is just a cultural thing, where I have to be accepted into this community of lobster harvesters in this particular harbor. And then, the harbor, the next harbor along the coast has its own community. And these are very long-standing traditions, within those communities. Often generations of people have been lobstering in those same areas. So you can see that's just one design principle, right? Mm-hmm. The first one, the social and physical boundaries. Other things are like having locally tailored rules. So not a one-size-fits-all approach. So each of those lobster harvesting communities have different rules for who can come in, how are we going to resolve disputes, because these come up. Sometimes, in like a city like Portland, there's a lot more flux. It's a big city. They may be more accepting of people coming in and out. Whereas, in a more rural area, it's very, very much, this is where we've been harvesting lobsters. This is the families that have been involved for a long time.
Right.
So it's not a one size fits all.
So these are just people getting together like a club or collective. It's nothing to do with, state regulation of lobster control or anything. That's great.
And that's what anthropologist Jim Atchison, he wrote a whole book called Lobster Gangs of Maine about how they do this on a very informal basis, but it's really fascinating to see it in action.
That's great. I didn't mean to interrupt you on the principles, but I found that really interesting.
So just a few of the other principles were things like monitoring the resource. So, how much groundwater is underground, because that's not really observable. So we have to collaborate and trust each other that we're, monitoring the resource appropriately. How many lobsters are there? And then penalties. So what do you do when people break the law, or not just the law, but these expectations of behavior, when someone puts a trap when they're not supposed to, or takes more water than they agreed upon. So they have to be graduated penalties, right? Maybe the first infraction is a slap on the wrist or a warning, and then it escalates from there. Having conflict management institutions that are accessible, and the authorities have to recognize a right to self-organize. Mm-hmm. So where with regards to the lobstering community, the state of Maine does have regulations that are strictly enforced about how many lobsters you can take, the size of the lobster, whether it has eggs, the female has eggs on it, you're supposed to throw it back. But the law also kind of gives space to these lobstering communities. Like, says like, hey, we're not going to really interfere too much in how you manage territory. If you want to manage territory, you can do that.
Mm-hmm.
And they just give them room. It's not actually the law. But in Spain, with the irrigation communities around Valencia, they have a 1,000-year tradition of the farmers managing the irrigation system and the canals, and they have water court that is set up to resolve conflicts. And the Spanish Constitution that was written in the 70s actually legally carves out the space for the water court, the Tribunal de las Aguas, to actually have jurisdiction over the water conflicts.
Oh, that's cool.
Associated with that.
That's still held in process today then, 1,000-year-old.
Yes.
That's great.
They meet every Thursday in front of the cathedral at noon. So when the bell of the cathedral strikes noon, the members of this water court, who are farmers that are elected by their peers to represent their canal district, they come together in, they call it the corralette, this little small corral that's fenced off, and they have this very public hearing about the water dispute. And
That's
you can
terrific.
witness it.
That would be fun to see, I think.
It is. It's a big tourist attraction.
I bet. I'll have to check that out someday. So do you see success in these, as a natural resource manager? Do you see things like this are, they're actually managing the resources properly in these collectives, and making way for future generations to still enjoy these resources?
In many cases, yes. There are lots of successes. There are lots of failures too. Mm-hmm. And, with all those 8 design principles, that's a lot that needs to go right in order to sustain a resource. So if you're missing even one of them, yes, people are complicated, and, people come and go, people move away, get new people arriving. So you've got to educate them on the way we do things here. The resources change over time. Fish will migrate, or species may come and go, so you need to be adapted. So there's really no one size fits all approach. And Ostrom like to say that there are no panaceas, right? There is no magic solution that's going to resolve everything. But she was very optimistic about the potential for people to be creative, to solve problems if given that democratic space to do so.
Good. And you mentioned the workshop. Can you talk a little bit about that a little bit more in detail? What exactly was that? Her and Vincent, I believe, created that, you said?
Yeah. Yes. So back in the early 70s, they came to Indiana University in the 60s, and they said, we need a research center. They were having some challenges with the administration and things like that. And there were some rules about what a research center was, very defined by the university and was controlled by that. They decided to say, well, we're going to set up this thing called a workshop, which is not a research center. So they try to avoid some administrative control over that. They wanted to do their own thing. But they chose this term workshop very specifically and intentionally. Vincent was an amateur woodworker. And when they arrived in Indiana, he studied with a master carpenter, master woodworker, and he was the apprentice. He was 50 years old, but was still apprenticing with this master woodworker. And that's the approach that they wanted to take at this workshop, was to have, scientists, social scientists, to be the masters of their craft, and have, students from undergraduates all the way up through PhDs and postdocs, be apprenticing with them. So it was a very hands-on approach, a very collaborative approach to education in a very practical way. And it's still going strong today.
Oh, I was going to ask that. Is it still going?
Yes. So they shortened the name just to the Ostrom Workshop now in honor of Lynn and Vincent. And it's expanded. So, a lot of the focus that Lynn did was on natural resource commons, but it has really broadened into knowledge commons and information, all kinds of data governance, the internet. These design principles are very universal, and they apply in all kinds of situations. Vincent was also very interested in democracy. He was more theoretical. Lynn was the practical one. Vincent was the more theoretical one. And so there's also a longstanding commitment to studying democracy And that's a core part of the Ostrom Workshop as well.
Interesting. They sound like very interesting people. And I think you do have a chapter in your book regarding going digital, the workshop going digital too. And it seems like this whole digital world is another commons in a way.
Yes, it can be, there's the physical hardware that has to work. So we have the internet that works. And so how do you determine internet addresses, these IP internet protocol rules? Everybody has to be on the same page with this stuff. And, so they formed, this committee that's not a government agency. It's like, we're going to just get together and collaborate and figure out this protocol where all the computers can talk to each other. And, as technology evolves and there are new standards, everybody has to agree on this. There's no global government that's going to tell you this is the way to do it. It's a very democratic process where everybody has to agree, and it's cumbersome, but somehow it works because we're talking through the computer right now.
Exactly. I was going to ask, did you get a chance to ever meet Elinor and Vincent? Have you?
I did not, unfortunately. I was a graduate student and I read her book, Governing the Commons. So I knew about her work and, I've been incorporating in my classes, but she passed away in 2012. So I never got to meet her. I was a visiting scholar at the Ostrom Workshop in 2019 and 2020 during my sabbatical where, I was able to immerse myself in her legacy and, learn about her work and, everybody associated with the workshop, because it really was a collaborative effort. It wasn't just them. So they were really welcoming, very helpful. And I really got to send a note of appreciation to everybody associated with the Ostrom Workshop.
Amazing. And your new book is coming out. Congratulations on that. I did receive a copy and I've been enjoying reading that. So thank you. Very interesting. And I didn't know anything about her before. So this is wonderful to understand this commons theory and how it affects our world today. But your book is coming out July 8th. In a few days. So congratulations. And where will people be able to find that book?
So the book is called The Uncommon Knowledge of Elinor Ostrom, Essential Lessons for Collective Action. And you can find it through the publisher's website. The publisher is Island Press. So islandpress.org. You can find it there. All the typical websites where you buy your books, your local bookstore. And if they don't have it in stock, you can always request it. They'll be able to order it for you really easily. And your local libraries. If they don't have it, you could always request it too. They might be able to obtain a copy for you. So libraries are an amazing resource. And they are they're a commons. So
exactly. That's true. That's great. And your book is interesting, and you do talk more in detail about the examples that you discussed here, like the Valencia water court and the Lobster Gangs and the water issue in LA and others too. That's great. Before we go though, I forgot to ask you, you talk a lot about in your book too, the Paris Agreement and how this approach kind of works with that. Is that the right way of saying? I guess my question is, is it true that the true approach of the Paris Agreement kind of reflects Ostrom's ideas of this shared governance and the Earth's climate system?
It really does. For many years, there was hope that, climate negotiations would come up with some, top-down global policy, whether it's a global carbon tax or something like that, where, everybody's going to be held responsible. And that's really inconsistent with Ostrom's design principles. Most of her work was, local commons, so a fishery, a forest. Climate change is in many ways a global commons. Mm-hmm. And there's some, even today, there's some discussion of like, how do you scale up these design principles, or can they even scale up to a global commons? So she was working on that topic in the 2000s, really right up until her death in 2012. And so as the Kyoto Protocol period kind of waned in the start of the second decade of the 21st century, people were looking for, what's going to replace it? Are we going to have a top-down solution? And I don't know how intentional it was, but what converged was very Ostromian. The Paris Agreement is, a voluntary approach based on pledges and peer review. So countries come forward with an emissions reduction pledge, like I'll reduce by 25% by 2030 or something like that. And then that pledge gets compared against, peer countries. So the United States pledge would be compared with countries in the European Union or Australia or Japan. And if it's not strong enough, the peers are going to say, hey, you look at our pledge, we're much stronger. You need to ratchet that up a little bit, so take advantage of that peer pressure. So this voluntary decentralized approach is really consistent with Ostrom's design principles, right? So there's no one size fits all. We're not going to say everybody has to do the same thing. It's
Right.
what you feel comfortable doing, but we're also going to push each other to do a little bit better. And then, within the United States, we have, 50 states plus territories. And how are they going to do that, right? Each state can have an approach to meeting that national goal. Mm-hmm. And that's a framework called polycentricity that both the Ostroms were very interested in, where you have different centers of decision making in a hierarchy. So we call in our federal government, we call that federalism, but you can have it in all kinds of resource systems, and they call that polycentricity. So that's something that can really work well. You don't need one size fits all solution. There's no panaceas, mm-hmm. but we can work together on shared goals.
I like that. I'm glad that we are back involved here in the U.S. with the Paris Agreement again. But before I let you go, I always ask people to, just learning about Elinor gives me hope. But what gives you hope about the future with all this going forward? Do you see more of this work happening in real world examples? And how can we help to get it out there as well?
I was just talking here in my own community. And I live just a few miles from Lake Michigan in the heart of the Great Lakes. And the community where my university is having groundwater issues. The area there is hydrologically disconnected Lake Michigan. And it's one of the fastest growing places in Michigan population wise. Lots of farms. It's blueberry season here. So the strain on the groundwater has been intense, and the groundwater levels are dropping precipitously. And it's like what happened in LA, 50 years ago is being recreated here. And I was really happy to see that they're following a lot of these design principles. There's a lot of collaboration among the townships, with the county, with the university. It's really polycentric management in action, which was really great to see. So I'm really optimistic. At the local level, you see it happening, and that success that's working out, and I'm optimistic.
That's great. That's great. And Michigan is my home state. I grew up in Traverse City, so.
Oh, no kidding.
So it's good to hear about Michigan and Lake Michigan.
Yeah. It's cherry season up there.
It is. The Cherry Festival starting, I think, this weekend.
Yes.
So, well, terrific. And so if people want to get involved, they just have to kind of pay attention to some of these things going on in their community and start, asking questions and getting involved, right?
That's right.
So that's terrific. So is there anything else you want to say about your book before I let you get on with your day today?
I'd like to, there are some really fantastic photos in the book, and I was able to collaborate with my longtime friend, Jason Roblando, who's a photographer at Illinois State University. We've been friends since high school. So this was a great opportunity for us to collaborate, bring together the science and the art. So thanks, Jason.
Yes, thank you. And if people, please go to islandpress.org or your library or where you buy your books and check this book out. I like that it's not written you don't need a PhD to follow this book. It's got interesting stories that that are enjoyable to hear, and her life is just amazing. So
it really is. Yeah. Thank you very much.
Thank you for joining us today, Erik, and have a good summer.
My pleasure. You too.
Thank I hope you all go visit islandpress.org for this book and other books that inspire change. And remember, you can get a 20% discount on Erik's book, The Uncommon Knowledge of Elinor Ostrom, Essential Lessons for Collective Action, by using the discount code in all caps in the discount code section at Island Press. and the code is uncommon. Again, that's all caps, and the code is uncommon. Today's background music was from Chantry Smith, and the title of the song was called Woman. Appropriate for today's show, I thought. Well, this concludes today's show, and I am Marcia Civic, and this is Bee Provided Conservation Radio. Thanks for listening. Stay safe and stay healthy.